Everybody that's listening, if you're listening to us on one of the podcasting sites, like, subscribe, share. If you are listening to us on one of the radio stations, we greatly appreciate that also. Keep listening to this segment because we are trying to get really good guests that have a lot to say, and we've been successful so far in doing that. So again, podcast people, radio people, greatly appreciate you guys listening in. We have a very special guest. I've been reading this man for years upon years on end, also listening to him on 740 The Team, 740 The Game now. The list goes on and on for that. This is the Bulldog, and I'm going to do a bark because I know he leads his show on 96.9 The Game every morning with the bark. So we'll tell the Bulldog. Mike Bianchi, Orlando Sentinel sports columnist. He's a radio show host, as I just stated, on Open Mic, 96.9 The Game. It's also 7:40 a.m. WYGM Orlando. Definitely check it out, 6 to 9 a.m. It's really 6 to 8. They do the bridge at 9. I mean, it's 6 to 9, and then they do the bridge rather with Mark Daniels, who, if you know UCF football, UCF basketball, and UCF baseball, you've definitely listened to Mark. And we've had him on the program before. And he is also an author. And you can find more about Mike at Bianchi Writes on Twitter. Mike, that was a heck of a mouthful for me to read. I greatly appreciate you coming on. And it's a pleasure to always listen to you in the morning from 6 to 9 on Open Mic.
Yeah, I don't usually get introduced with a bulldog bark like that. Yeah, that's my nickname on the radio, the Bulldog. Obviously, as you probably know, the Mad Dog, Chris Russo, got his start. A former Rollins College grad, he got his start at FM 96.9 The Game. It wasn't FM 96.9 The Game back then, but yeah, that was his first radio gig as well.
I want to talk about this before we even kick it around and get into the nits and crannies of the interview, Mike. I'll tell you what, I was very worried as a Magic fan when I listened on Monday morning and I did not hear your voice. And I was worried that a Cavaliers fan maybe kidnapped you, did something very even worse than that to you. But what happened? Let's even tap that off before we get into the interview. What happened at the Cavs game where, you know, the Magic had an 18-point lead, really came out strong? And I was talking to one of the podcasting guys that does a podcast for the Magic, Locked On Magic, Philip Rossman Rice. He's always in the media room. I know you were in the media room with the Magic the past couple games for them too. And he talked about the Magic maybe peaked too early in that game with that 18-point lead. So you were there. Talk about that game before we even kick it around into your writing and the radio show.
Yeah, I thought the Magic had the game, honestly. 18-point lead late in the second half. I understand that it's the NBA and it's a game of streaks and all of that, but the Cavaliers looked absolutely discombobulated in that game. Their crowd was starting to boo them. I said, hey, the Magic are going to take this. The Magic are going to Boston for the second round. And then, I mean, there's really no strategy. No tactical thing that happened. We know what basketball is, and we make it too complex. It's a game of making baskets, thus the name basketball. And Paolo Banchero, he did his job, making baskets, but he had no help. It was a one-man show. Franz Wagner, his running mate, traditionally, really good player, but he had his worst game as a pro. 1 of 15 from the floor, only scored 6 points. Jalen Suggs, the other leading scorer for the Magic, he didn't hit his shots. Combined Jalen Suggs and Franz Wagner were 3 of 28. That's the game right there.
So. Yeah, it was terrible for a man that you and I should say even both, but me, I've been a Magic fan since back to the Shaq days, the Penny days. I love T-Mac. He was my favorite player. We don't have to go through all what happened in those days, but, we finally thought that the Magic had something there with this good young team. I haven't seen a team like this, Mike, since the Hot and Hustle days in that 99-2000 with Darrell Armstrong leading the charge, where that team was really together. Obviously, they did not make the playoffs, but that was kind of the start of that Magic team. And again, who knows what would have happened in those 4 or 5 years
Yeah,
with
they should have kept
yeah.
they should have kept that heart and hustle team together instead of going and getting Grant Hill
Yeah,
because
you ain't kidding.
yeah, that heart and hustle team they traded away Ben Wallace,
Right.
Chauncey Billups, and there was one other a guy who turned out to be a really good player that they traded away to make room for Grant Hill and Tracy McGrady. So yeah.
Well, yeah, and then the talk about Tim Duncan maybe coming to that team. I know we don't have to go down. It's in the past, is in the past. And I do want to move on to the interview because we do have some audience questions of people that are fond of you, that have listened to you in the past and in the present, want to ask. So I do want to get to all these questions and be, gracious with your time today. So let's talk about the newspaper industry. Obviously, you've been in the industry for quite a long time, being with the Sun, being in Jacksonville with the Union Times, and also in Orlando. The newspaper industry has changed a lot. I'm 34. I used to go down to Orlando from Rhode Island, and maybe this is a sick thing, but I used to have my uncle who lived in Winter Garden save all the sports sections from the time that I wasn't in Orlando, and I would kind of catch up and read it. I wouldn't go through every article, but I would kind of read about the Magic that I missed. Again, it might be a little bit of a sick thing that I was into when I was younger, but I liked reading about the news of my favorite team, even if it was old news. Obviously, newspapers changed. We don't even see the newspaper stands out there. We used to put the 50 cents in and take the paper. Those are gone in general. So talk about the newspaper industry and how it's changed from when you started up until now, where you're still writing, but a lot has changed.
Yeah, a lot has changed. Obviously, it's shrunk a lot. I'm at the newsroom. Used to be a happening place. We don't even have a newsroom anymore at
Yeah.
the Orlando Sentinel, essentially. So yeah, there's obviously with the advent of the internet, the newspaper industry wasn't ready for that. They didn't bank on I always joke like newspaper editors and publishers back in the day were like, oh, this internet's just a passing phase. All right. That was sort of their way of thinking. There'll always be a place for newspapers. Well, that's not the case, obviously. Not many people even get the physical newspaper anymore. Most of it's digital now, and newspapers never discovered a way really to monetize digital and to monetize the internet, and thus the shrinking of the industry. A lot of layoffs, a lot of reporters. The staffs aren't big. Because of that, the investigative journalism isn't what it once was because you have so few reporters trying to cover so much news in their particular area that again, it's newspapers or I should say digital newspapers are, I mean, it's still to me the most credible form of journalism in a community, but sadly, we don't cover the community like we used to.
Well, we've interviewed on this program people from the Guild, from the Sentinel, and that's a little bit of a topic that I kind of want to get into. Not the unionization as far as that part, but the layoff issue that you kind of brought up. We've seen the private equities come in and really scoop up these newspapers. Obviously, Alden has scooped up the Sentinel, but many other newspapers around the country, local and also even bigger newspapers than that. With that said, in the cut, as you stated, of local reporters, and it seems like, as you stated, it's the newsrooms are gone or extremely bare. How do you feel like this has changed the newspaper industry? Because again, and you kind of stated, but I just want to kind of flip the script with this. With Alden and these big companies taking over, do you feel like the journalism is getting worse and worse year after year? And sooner more than later, people are going to just go fully away from the Orlando Sentinel, the Sun Sentinel, other local papers around the country, and they're just going to the blogs or Twitter. And some Yahoo on Twitter writes this big story that might be true, but it could be a lot of gobbledygook nonsense too. So do you feel like, I guess, getting to the question, Alden and these private equity firms have ruined newspapers more so than the internet really? And again, the internet has done the damage too, because these articles are outdated, very quick because news is moving at the speed of light. But the private equity firms, I would say, have done more than the internet. Maybe you disagree.
I do disagree with
Okay.
that. I do disagree because yes, the private equity firms, they have bought up some of the newspapers and see it as a way to, again, turn a profit.
Right.
But let's face it, if the newspapers were themselves profitable to begin with, some of these big newspaper companies, the Tribune Company, for instance, and some of these other they wouldn't have been selling the newspapers. All right. So, and I'm not defending the equity firms here, but newspapers were making massive cuts before Alden and this grill. When the Tribune Company owned the Sentinel, we were laying off people left and right because they weren't making a profit. So again, I don't know that it's that much worse now with the equity firms, and I don't think the journalism is worse. I think the journalism is just as good, if not better. It's just that there's not enough manpower to cover everything that needs to be covered. I mean, I'll just use the Sentinel as an example. We used to have a full-time writer cover Orlando City, the MLS team in town. All right, Orlando City, Major League Soccer. We used to make a big deal out of Orlando City. We had some really good writers cover Orlando City. Paul Tenorio, who now works for The Athletic, he's one of the best soccer writers in the country. He got his start covering Orlando City at the Orlando Sentinel, and now we don't even have a full-time writer covering Orlando City. So that's just one specific example of we don't cover things as comprehensively as we used to.
Yeah. I want to talk about this last question on newspapers before we go into sports talk radio. Tapping on the Orlando Sentinel. So, do you see that the Orlando Sentinel eventually down the road will die out and there will be no Orlando Sentinel, or will they just continue on, as you stated, stay online and just do online reporting as they pretty much are doing now, because a lot of people aren't getting delivery like they used to? And just to tap on delivery, will delivery just die? Because again, there's not a lot of people getting delivery now because of the internet, as you stated.
Well, delivery is already dying in some places. My old newspaper, the Gainesville Sun, they're not even delivering their newspaper anymore. They're mailing it out. So you're getting old news, 3 days later than you used to get it. So yeah, the actual newspaper product, the physical newspaper and the printed product, I think, is eventually going to die out. But right now, it's still pretty profitable. The actual physical Sunday newspaper makes a lot of money for these newspaper companies. Now, that's the only paper some people get, or a lot of people only get the Sunday paper, but they're still getting that. You're still able to sell advertising in the Sunday paper. But eventually, yes, I do think it's going to be strictly an online product. Hopefully, newspapers will do a better job monetizing that online product, because I do think, as I've stated before, I do think newspapers, I'll use sports as an example. I think newspaper writers and columnists, they cover sports as journalists. Do you really want to go to a world where you're reading your sports coverage on the fan websites and the team websites? Are you really getting an unbiased view when that happens?
No, not at all. And I agree with you, because there was so many really good Orlando Sentinel columnists, and I believe one is, and I'm dating myself here, was Brian. Was it Brian Schmitz?
Brian Schmitz, absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah.
and he was there for quite a long time. I used to read him. Obviously, you've been there for years upon years on end. And it just seems like, again, the depletion of the right is and going toward this biased view and just going towards, like I just stated on Twitter. It's all this biased stuff, and it's whoever's writing it, it's their opinion. And people want to hear Magic news, Tampa Bay Rays news, Buccaneers news. The list goes on and on. Orlando City, Orlando Pride news. They want to hear it not from the team website, which
Right.
is going to be toting the team line, as you stated, Mike, but they want to hear it unbiased. And that's why I think a lot of people are turning towards podcasts, and let's kick into sports radio and podcasting. So obviously you've been with 740 the team, 740 the game for quite a long time. Let's kick this around. And I want to go back into a time when, and I told you I used to be very close with Jerry. We talked the other day, and I, used to listen to him and the Shot Doctor, the Finish Line. Obviously went off the air in 2019. But let's go back to 06 through 08. We're going back into that time of the recession in this country where there was a lot of layoffs. Obviously, at that time, you guys were with Clear Channel. They made those budget cuts. We saw Mark Daniels got let go. Jerry O'Neill left and went with Mike Tuck across town. The station was switched to Spanish radio. Were you worried in that time that sports radio in Orlando was about to die because the local shows were really getting crushed at that time?
Yeah, and it essentially did die
Yeah.
for a while. Yes. 740 the game, which is now, still 740 the game, but now we have FM and all of that and high def radio and streaming and all of that. But yeah, that was the big sports station in Orlando. That's the one all the sports fans listened to. And then when they laid everybody off and went to a Spanish radio for a Latin radio format, and Jerry did go across town, but he went to a station that really nobody knew about and didn't do much promotion. So yeah, it was a dry time for sports radio in Orlando. Eventually, I think Clear Channel / iHeartMedia now, I think they discovered their error of their ways and they brought sports radio back to their format. iHeartMedia, obviously the biggest radio company in the country. So, and you need to be on a station that's going to promote itself, that's going to be out there and have the broadcast like the station I work for, 740 FM 96.9 the game. They have the Magic, they have Orlando City, they have UCF. So you want a sports station that also has a tie-in with the teams, because that I think that helps the product, because at night people want to listen to the games if they're driving around in their car, and next morning radio's on that station and you're listening to the sports radio broadcaster talk about the game you were listening to or watching the night before. So yeah, I actually think sports radio in Orlando now is as healthy as it's ever been.
Okay. Yeah, because you're doing drive time and people want to listen. They're like you sometimes. I know you're on at 6 a.m. They go to bed early. They
Right.
can't be watching a late night game with the Magic in Denver or the Magic in the Lakers, and they're depending on you and Kelly Velez to tell them what happened in the game and talk about the game, to recap it. And in 2006 to 2008, in that big gap, and even after that, it was still the Orlando sports radio stations were still kind of a little hazy as far as the listenership because of all that depletion. Mike, that was the time in 2009 that the Magic went to the NBA Finals. They were at their peak from before the last time they were at that start was when the Shaq days. So there's no real sports radio in this time frame when the Magic are really getting good. And they, the next year they lost, I believe it was the Celtics after that. But regardless of that, they were really kicking butt, and all these sports fans in Orlando couldn't really listen to any good sports radio. So it
I'm
was
trying.
really
Your
bad.
memory is much better than mine. I'm trying to like I don't remember the state of sports radio in 2009. I know I wasn't on the air yet. What I don't even remember. Was
Well, it was
740 back?
1080. It was 1080 with Jerry and Mike Talk over at that was I think it was WHOO or whatever
Yeah.
I think that was their call numbers.
Mhm.
Anyways, regardless, it was them, and then I think maybe Mark Daniels might have been back on the radio, and that's about it because they had
Hmm.
all those syndicated shows, Jim Rome and all
Oh
these
yeah.
other guys. And I mean, listen, if you're a
What about
local
Dan
guy,
Cilio? What about you remember Dan
yeah,
Cilio? When
Dan
was
Cilio, former football player, he was on in the mornings. I think he
yeah.
was like the morning guy.
Yeah.
For quite a long time, he was there.
Was he
Anyway,
was he on the radio when the Magic won the
I,
championship?
I honestly don't remember. I
Yeah,
know he
I
was
don't remember.
syndicated in a couple different markets in the morning, like like you are now also. But and then I think that went down back in that 6 to 8, 2006, 2008. And then I don't know if he came back on. But regardless of that, Mike, it just kind of was a tragedy that Orlando sports radio really kind of was depleted at that time when the Magic were really in a good spot. And I mean, obviously, they went down after that because of the Dwight movement and him leaving
Nightmare.
to go to the Lakers. But regardless of that, they were in a good spot um, as far as that goes. So let's talk about this, Mike. And again, for people listening, I do want to tell people that are listening who they are listening to. This is the Bulldog, Mike Bianchi. He is an Orlando Sentinel sports columnist, a radio host at on Open Mic. It's 6 to 9 a.m., 96.9 FM, The Game. You can also listen to it on 7:40 a.m. It's WYGM Orlando. So let's talk about this, Mike, because when we talk about sports radio, and I told you this, I used to call in Cherry O'Neill and the Shot Doctor. This is going back to the days when obviously I'm growing up in Rhode Island. I can't listen to you guys on the radio, but I can listen to you guys on 740theteam.com. And this is back in the days when they had all that buffering. It was very tough to listen to radio shows in Orlando on the internet because there was tons of buffering sometimes. Sometimes it was good, though, but a lot of times it was bad. But there was a lot of call-in shows. Specifically, the Finish Line was a call-in show. Mark Daniels show, Coaching Company, if we're going back to those days, he had a call-in show. It seems like the call-in shows have kind of really dissipated, which I really liked because you want to hear what your local audience is thinking, whether it's the Magic, whether it's Orlando City, Orlando Pride, the Rays, the Bucs, the Jags, the list goes on and on. And we are not getting that anymore from local sports talk radio show hosts. Why is that, Mike?
Uh, First of all, I don't think I think the way people communicate has changed, whether it be in real life or in sports radio. I mean, we get tons. I mean, we actually will take calls. We just don't
Yeah, I
get
know you
many.
say it every day, but for some reason, apparently no one calls in. I don't understand that
Yeah,
either.
we
I'm going to
don't get
start
many.
calling in, I think.
Yeah, we don't get many calls at all, but we get tons of texts.
Right.
I just think, and morning drive is different than afternoon drive. You usually get more calls in afternoon drive than morning drive. Morning drive, people are like, on their way, getting ready for work. They're in a hurry. Afternoon, they're sort of, more leisurely and have time to call. But again, we get tons of text. We get talkbacks now where we have a talkback
Yeah.
line where you just call in and you can leave your hot take. Then I don't think people want to, in this instant gratification society, I don't think people want to wait 20, 30 minutes before they get on. I mean, we used to have back in the day, people would wait 30, 45
Right.
minutes to get their phone call in. I just don't think people are willing to do that today, especially when you can shoot a text in or you can do the talk back and leave the take there. So I just think it's a different way of communication, not just in sports radio, but in the world in general.
I think it's a lot to do with the social media aspect of our
And Twitter.
society.
Yeah, we get a lot of
Yeah,
response on
right.
Twitter.
And also that people's attention spans are very low right now. As you stated, they do not want to wait online. Listen, I love talking to people. Maybe it's, I'm in my early 30s. I'm 33 years old, and I still like to get the physical newspaper. I don't get it every day anymore because they charge like $5 now.
Right.
Pay $4.50 for the daily, and I'm like, this thing is like thin as a rail. Like, I'm not going to pay $4.50 for what I can read online at orlandosentinel.com. But regardless of that, I'm the type of guy that's, maybe I'm still young, but I'm still old school in the way that I like to talk on the phone to people. I like to read the physical newspaper, but we're losing that. And I don't think that's good in our society. I know that's a different debate for a different time, but I think that socially, it's hurt our society that we don't like to engage with each other, and we just like to do the text or things on
Right.
the computer. And I think it's hurting the younger kids too, because I'm young, but I'm not as young as a lot of these kids growing up. And I saw this even in college down in Florida. Is, you're walking, you're passing a girl or a guy, and you're looking at them. They look right down to the phone, and then once they walk past you, they look up again. And I don't know how that's going to work in jobs for them. The handshakes are weak. I know that's more of a societal issue than more of a sports issue, but I do think it gears to what we were just talking about in sports radio. But just to kind of move on to sports radio with podcasting. So obviously, we are doing a podcast right now, you and I. How do you feel like podcasting has changed sports radio? That a lot of people are just gearing to, hey, I want to just listen to what Mike Bianchi says, and that's it. I want to listen to Colin Cowherd, and that's it. I want to listen to name your NBA player, Shaq. Charles Barkley does a podcast. Everybody's doing podcasts. Do you believe that's hurting sports radio, or maybe it's helped sports radio? Maybe you believe that.
Well, it's a catch-22 situation, obviously, because yeah, we do our show. We also, podcast the show where you can listen to it anytime you want. So we are getting listeners, that listen to us when they get home from work, or they listen to us when they're at the gym on the treadmill that day. So you're getting additional listeners in that way, but in another way, and I don't know if this is bad for it. I guess it's bad for anybody in the information industry. There's so much information out there, and so much good information out there. I mean, hell, I'd want to listen to Charles Barkley podcast over me any day. All right. So if given the choice, people have so many. It's why TV ratings are down across the board, because used to be you had 3 TV stations and 3 networks, and that was the TV you watch. Now you have a zillion channels, a zillion different broadcasts, different interests. So people have choices now, and podcast is the ultimate democracy. Anybody can, very cheaply do a podcast, and it's pretty good sound quality. And if you're really good at it, you're going to build a following. Pat McAfee, for instance.
Yeah. He's been really successful at it.
Bill Simmons back in the day. I mean, isn't that how sort of he became huge? Right. Dan Le Batard has built a podcasting network. Colin Cowherd now has a network of podcasts. So yeah, if you're good, that's what I always tell young reporters or young broadcasters today. Hey, there's a lot of, even though the media industry, the newspaper industry, and even the radio industry is shrinking a little bit, there are still actually shrinking a lot. There are still a lot of options. If you're good and if you're motivated, I mean, there are so many platforms out there now, from Substack, if you're a writer, to, all the podcasting networks. You can do your own podcast, promote yourself on social media, build a following. So for people looking to get into the industry, I think this is actually a good time.
Last question before we get into the speed round. What do you hope that your listeners that listen to Open Mic, again, 6 to 9 a.m., 96.9 The Game, FM, this is WYGN Orlando. So with people listening every day, what do you hope the listeners get out of the show with you and Kelly Velez?
I hope they're entertained. For the what is it? The average radio listener on their drive to work is listening for about 20 minutes. I hope they're entertained on their drive to work. I mean, to me, sports radio um is about entertainment, and it's about opinions. I try to split up my newspaper columnist job. I think you have to be a little more serious, a little more, maybe even, I don't know if this is the right word, credible. Like,
But
for
you're
instance,
credible, Mike, but you're playful also in your
yeah, I try to be credible on the radio, but I'll just throw something out there on the radio that, I don't have no basis of the information. I'll just throw it out there to give us a topic to talk about. So, and we have a lot of fun on the radio. That's a little harder to do in a written format. So I just want people to be entertained. I think sports is entertainment. Let's not forget that. It's not life and death. It's not the most serious thing in the world. So, I try to take somewhat of a light-hearted approach to sports on the radio, unless it's time to get angry or a time to get concerned about certain issues, topical issues in sports. But I try mostly to have fun on the radio, and I want our listeners to have fun as well.
So again, I hope people enjoyed our conversation today with Mike Bianchi, the Bulldog. Again, 96.9 The Game FM, WYGM Orlando, 6 to 9 a.m. Definitely check him out. It's Monday through Friday with his co-host Kelly Velez. We're going to run through the gamut here with some quick audience questions fast. And just to speak out on the first question here, what was your favorite story that you ever covered, whether it's from the Sentinel, the Union Times, or also the Gainesville Sun?
Oh, wow. Whoa. Obviously, college football is a big, big topic in the state of Florida. I grew up a college football fan, so college football's always been my favorite sport. Covering the Gators, winning their first SEC championship in 1991 under Spurrier, the first SEC championship game. Those were big. Watching the Gators and Florida State win national championships. I was at the Florida State Oklahoma Orange Bowl where Bobby Bowden uh, actually, that wasn't the one they won. I was at the one they won. They actually lost the one to Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl. But one of my favorite national stories was I was at the Masters in 1996 when Tiger Woods won his first Masters, and it was a huge deal. Obviously, it was a young Tiger Woods, and I still remember, and I've told this story many times. Tiger Woods was walking up the 18th fairway, and he already had the tournament in hand, and he was getting the cheers, and a lot of the staff at Augusta National were black, or I don't know if they still are. I haven't been to the Masters, but they were black, and they all came out of like the clubhouse and the restaurants at Augusta National, and they were there because they wanted to see Tiger Woods become the first black man to win Augusta National. So that, to me, that was really sort of a social awakening for sports at that place, Augusta National, that had really been, it had a racist past, and here was the first man of color ever to win at Augusta National.
And you did meet Tiger Woods in the toilet.
I did, at the urinal at the Magic game, yes. I interviewed him, in press conference settings a number of times, but yeah.
Sorry, we had to bring that. We had to bring that one out because I heard that on the radio a couple of days back. Anyways, regardless, we'll move forward. So obviously, you've worked with a lot of different people, whether it's Mark Daniels, Brian Kravitz. You've worked with Jerry O'Neill, the shot doctor. Give us some stories as a person like myself that's listened to these guys in the past and some in the present because they're still working there. Give us some stories about working with these guys. Maybe some funny ones, maybe some not so funny ones. I don't know.
Let's see. Shot doctor. What do I remember about the shot doctor?
I remember
Shot,
that he used to go to a lot of baseball stadiums.
yeah, shot doctor. The thing with the shot doctor, how he was on the radio, good evening, good to see you
See
again.
you
That
again.
was how he was in real life. I don't think that's how he really is. Maybe among his closest friends, but to just people he comes into contact with, even us at the station, he was always the shot doctor. He was always on, and so yeah, and I just think it's a fascinating story how he became like the. For a while, the shot doctor was probably the biggest name, most famous guy in sports talk radio in Orlando, and he started out as a call-in guy. He was
Oh,
a
wow.
Yeah, he was a bag boy at a local grocery store, cash and carry, I think it was. And he would call in every day to, I think it was Jerry O'Neill and Greg Warmouth back in the day were doing the morning show. And he would call in and he was so funny on the radio that they brought him in as part of their show. And then he became a sports radio host. So that would be my shot doctor story. Mark Daniels he's the consummate professional. I mean, Mark Daniels is so good at broadcasting. He's so good at thinking on his feet. He like when I do a show, I prepare a lot for my radio show. Mark Daniels prepares a lot too, but he could come in and do a show, boom, off the top of his head, think nothing of it. So he's just the consummate professional in my mind. Jerry O'Neill. I didn't really work with Jerry that much. I did make fun of Jerry one time.
Yeah,
There one
I
time,
heard in the last show that he brought you up quite a few times in his
so
last
so
show.
so there was the Magic were playing the who were they playing? They were playing the Pistons in the playoffs one year. This was back,
Is
I
that
think
O
it was,
three with the T-Mac when they went
yeah,
up
I think it
three
was.
zero?
I think it was. Yeah, I think and he had a writer on from Detroit. Okay, from Detroit. I can't remember the guy's name, but the writer was a little bit, arrogant, sort of talking down about the Magic as this upstart team and all of this stuff, and the proud Pistons and all of their heritage and history as an NBA franchise. So Jerry interviews him, all right, on the radio, and then the guy hangs up after the interview's done, and Jerry O'Neill just starts ripping the guy on the air. So the next game, Jerry O'Neill shows up, and the guy says, I heard you on the radio after I got off the air. I go, why didn't you have the guts to say that? And they were like nose to nose, and the guy was much bigger than Jerry. Yeah. And the next day I go, Jerry, that guy was gonna kill you. He would have killed you. And Jerry goes, no, I may be small, but I'm feisty. But always made fun of Jerry O'Neill for ripping the guy after he got off the air. So
What
um
is it like to work with Kelly Velez? You guys seem like you have real good chemistry together. He's like you're Robin. You're like you're the Batman. He's the Robin. Excuse me.
well, it's fun working with Kelly because he's totally different than
Yeah.
me. I mean, he comes from, he grew up in Harlem. He's he's got a sort of a big city perspective. He's obviously he's Puerto Rican, so he's got that perspective as well. He's got he's a hip hop guy. I'm a classic rock guy. So it's fun working with somebody like that and getting their perspective, and he gets my perspective. And we don't get into debates, but you sometimes our takes come from how we grew up, and So I love it. He's one of the most pleasurable and hardest working guys I've ever worked with.
No, it is real great chemistry. If you're listening, I do hope that people listen to 96.9 The Game, WYGM Orlando, 6 to 9 a.m. for open mic. It's really great chemistry. Last three questions. Again, we'll go through these very fast. Is Orlando closer to getting a football team or a baseball team, Mike?
Wow. Neither.
Well, we hear a lot about the Pat Williams trying to bring the baseball team to Orlando. Maybe that's fantasy. I don't know. I just hear a lot about this.
Well, it's Pat's dream to do that,
Right.
but the fact of the matter is, right now there's no team available, and he was trying to get a stadium built with no team. It's like that's not going to happen. They're not going to spend $800 million to build a stadium if there's not an assurance of a team coming. So,
but it was supposed to be the Rays, right? And now they're looking at Ybor City.
yeah, and and there were contingency plans. They weren't going to build the actual stadium unless they got an assurance from the team that they were coming. But I still say football. If I had to pick one, it would be the NFL. Orlando's sort of, they're sort of in the NFL's what's the word I'm looking for? The NFL is very aware of Orlando. They realize Orlando's the biggest city in America without an NFL team. They have their Pro Bowl here, their Pro Bowl games here, so they're very aware of Orlando because of that. There's talk the Jaguars are going to play here when their stadium is being renovated in a year or two. So I think the NFL is more aware of Orlando than Major League Baseball is. That's why I think Orlando would have a much better chance of getting an NFL team. And plus, I mean, let's face it, the NFL is the king of all sports. I think if politicians are going to go to bat to bring a sport to town and spend the money to build a stadium, that, it would be much more popular for them to do that with an NFL team rather than a Major League Baseball team.
Just a follow up, would that be at the Citrus Bowl because they just redid it? Or would they do a full brand new stadium?
I don't think it, even though the Citrus Bowl is going to be a lot nicer than it was or is right now, it's still not the quality of these NFL stadiums. I mean, the Jaguars are getting ready to put $2 billion into essentially tearing down their stadium and rebuilding it up in Jacksonville. Orlando's putting, what are they putting? 400 million into the Citrus Bowl. You do the math.
No, I hear you. Last question. The Magic obviously had a great year. What do you see them doing in the offseason? I know there's been talk about Paul George, Malik Monk. There's other names in the mix, Tyus Jones. Do you see any of those guys coming? I worry that they're going to do nothing, but I also want them to do a little bit of tinkering. I don't want them to do nothing.
I think they'll do a little bit of tinkering. I don't think they're going to bring in Paul George. I don't think they're going to bring in Klay Thompson unless they can get him for a short-term deal at a reasonable price. But yeah, I think they're going to do something. They do have cap space. They know they need to improve their shooting. But what I think they need to do is they need to make sure that, hey, we've got our superstar now. Paolo Banchero is our guy. We're not going to do anything to risk. He's got to be the alpha dog on this team. He's got to be the guy standing on top of the mountain. They don't want to bring anybody in here like a Paul George who might think that this is his team, because it's not. They've got a 21-year-old monster of a superstar right now, and they need to do everything to make sure he is the centerpiece of the franchise.
They need to sign all three guys, Jalen Suggs, Franz Wagner, and Paolo Banchero to long-term contracts, and that's what they definitely need to get done this summer and next. Again, for people listening, the Bulldog Mike Bianchi, Orlando Sentinel sports columnist, and the radio host on Open Mic 96.9 The Game, WYGM Orlando. Mike, thanks so much for coming on. Can we get a Bulldog bark before we end?
Rob, just for you.
Thank you, Mike, for coming on. And I look forward to listening to you. And I'm going to definitely call in and state my opinions from now on. Not every day, but every once in a while for sure.
Appreciate it, Rob. Thanks.